while this loneliness thing is happening, the riptide of societal, cultural, and technological change has an eerie rhyme to about 100 years ago. I started making a note of what happened in the 1920s, what's happening in the 2020s, and it's very profound shifts around how much we do almost everything. So we entered this period of time with a plague. The COVID-19 will probably be looked at as a plague. Plagues reorder society. They become an existential threat where people say, is this what I'm doing with my life? And we've seen it around work. We've seen people think very differently about work because of this 3-4 year pause we had, many of us had. Next is we're moving into a new era. We're going out of the technology era into the augmented era. Labor disruption in the 1920s was physical. We started seeing replacement of physical labor by electrification and the products that came with it. Now we're starting to see a replacement of some of our cognitive labor. Our work hours changed in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we got the 5-day-a-week, 40-hour work week, 8-hour day. And that really came in part from unions, but it actually started with Henry Ford. He noticed in around 1914, 1916, that all the accidents were happening on the production line in the 9th, 10th, and 11th hour. It became very unprofitable to have people work longer than 8 hours. So he capped the workday at 8 hours. Unions came in and capped it at 5 days a week. He did that to optimize physical labor. Now what we're doing with whether it's hybrid work or 4-day work weeks or more flex time or more breaks or better sleep is we're trying to optimize for cognitive labor. Because even if you're doing physical labor, you're most likely also doing some cognitive labor. More and more of us are doing some form of cognitive labor, and we're not optimized for it at all, which is why we're seeing such high rates of burnout. Gender role change. In the 1920s, women got the right to vote. So women went from being property to participating in progress to having some power. Now we're seeing a really profound change around gender and sexuality, particularly with the younger generations, and it's happening globally at almost the same rate. Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality. We are at the highest rate of income inequality since the 1920s. If this is the high rate up here and this is the high rate up here, the dip like that was the last 100 years. We're almost at the exact same rate. Why does it matter? It matters for a few reasons. One, high levels of income inequality are usually what you see in countries that are not thriving. A big, strong, building middle class is a sign of good economic growth. Economic opportunity, which I think is America's best invention, that my kids are going to do better than I did. We have the first generation now that might not. So it has real implications. Immigration, I don't touch on it as a political issue, but we also have the highest rate of folks who were born outside the US now that we did in the 1920s with that same dip, the same as the income inequality. The cultural reaction to the income inequality, the gender roles, the changing demographics in the 1920s, we saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Scares around communism. Now we're seeing a rise in some domestic terrorism groups. And then geopolitically, I know we've got an election coming up and there's a lot to talk about there, which I won't. But this year, 4 billion people vote in the world. It's 40–50% of the population of the planet. It's never been that high before. So the political polarization and the potential change, geopolitical shifts, are happening globally. So if you look at all these things together, by the way, in the 1920s, we saw a rise of fascism between World War I and World War II that was happening globally. Now we're seeing a decline in democracy for the first time since we've been trending up this way with democracies around the world since World War II. Now we're starting to see a decline in it. So all these things, a lot of these things are global, and if you look at them, the first is an existential crisis, as I said, and I think it's changing where work fits for people. I say that it's not about where people work, it's about where work fits in their lives, and I think that's what's happening for a lot of folks. We're shifting a lot in our economy. We're going into a new economic era, which we can't seem to predict. And then we've got a lot of societal and cultural shifts that many folks are struggling to adapt to. And then we potentially have a geostrategic shift. Because if we are no longer a great collection of democracies collaborating together, how do we operate as a world order? How do we make sense of things? So as all those things are taking place, for some people, those have led to, I can't trust you. And where trust comes into work, which underpins collaborative exploration,